You ever been fined $500 by a woman wearing pearls and a windbreaker like she's the sheriff of suburbia? I have. And all because my trash bin was angled 6 degrees off center, according to her clipboard. I'd been at the cabin for 23 minutes. Not even long enough for the coffee to finish brewing. "You're in violation of Clearwater Ridge community standards," she said, with a smile so tight it could crack drywall. Her name was Deborah Wexley, president of the HOA and apparently the self-appointed guardian of lawn gnomes and trash placement. I laughed. At first, thought it was a joke. But when she handed me an envelope with the kind of precision usually reserved for FBI raids, I realized this wasn't a "welcome to the neighborhood." It was a declaration of war. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If you love wild, true-feeling stories packed with twists, justice, and just the right amount of HOA chaos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is even more jaw-dropping, and trust me, the surprises coming next, you won't want to miss them. The cabin had been my grandfather's slice of peace for 50 years, a quiet spot near Lake Mayfield in Montana, passed to me after he passed away. Cedar siding, wooden porch, view of the water like a Bob Ross painting. It had been the one place in my life untouched by noise, until Deborah showed up with regulations like she was rolling out a new religion. "You'll find everything outlined in the guidelines," she chirped, handing me a folder thicker than a church hymnal. I flipped it open and saw violations for fence material, bird feeders, and a section about architectural color harmony that sounded like it had been written by an interior designer having a nervous breakdown. "Earth tone neutrals only," she added, nodding at the cedar siding like it had personally offended her. I told her my grandfather never mentioned any HOA. That's when she smiled wider. Dangerously so. "The HOA was founded in 2019, she said, "and your grandfather was grandfathered in. But now that ownership has changed." She let the silence finish the sentence. What she meant was now that the old man was gone, they could finally sink their teeth into the property. She handed me a fine for the trash bin, plus a warning about repainting the cabin to match the rest of the neighborhood. Apparently, Cedar Brown wasn't HOA chic. The cost of compliance, according to her inspector's notes, would be about 15 grand. I stared at her like she'd just asked me to replace the mountains. "You have 30 days to start," she said, walking off in heels that clicked like a ticking clock. Now, I've faced firestorms, literally. Retired firefighter, 28 years on the job. I've pulled people out of burning buildings, but nothing prepared me for a woman who measured bird feeders with a tape measure and weaponized landscaping rules like a hobby. The next day, I met my neighbor, Maureen Diaz, who sat on her porch sipping black coffee and shaking her head like she'd seen this movie before. "Deborah's been terrorizing this place for years," she said. "You're not the first. Won't be the last." She told me about families who got fined for letting kids leave toys in the yard or for playing music that didn't pass the HOA's harmonious noise standards. One guy had to remove his vegetable garden. Apparently kale wasn't on the approved aesthetic list. Deborah wasn't enforcing rules. She was building a throne out of fine print. I should have packed it in right then, sold the place, and left her to her beige kingdom. But something about the way she looked at my grandfather's cabin, like it was a mistake she planned to erase, lit a fire in me I hadn't felt in years. I told myself I'd play along, repaint the cabin, move the trash can, swap out the fence, just enough to get her off my back. I didn't realize then that people like Deborah don't stop when you give in, they escalate. And I was about to learn that the hard way, because the next visit came with a measuring wheel, a code inspector, and a list of new demands that made my blood boil. But that, my friend, is where things start getting interesting. Because when someone tries to bully you off land your family built with their hands, you don't just repaint. You retaliate. The thing about trying to appease a petty tyrant is, once you bend the knee, they start expecting a bow. So I repainted the cabin, covered up decades of my grandfather's hard-earned cedar charm with a color the HOA manual called Harvest Taupe, but looked more like sun-dried cardboard. Hired a guy named Dusty, who charged me $3,000 to make my cabin look like a DMV building. Then came the fence, vinyl. Approved shade of beige, smooth as a hospital wall and just as soulless. I even bought one of those fancy contractor rulers to position my trash can exactly 18 inches from the curb. Parallel, precise, like I was prepping for a home inspection at the White House. I thought I'd finally earned a break from Deborah's neighborhood inquisition. Instead, what I got was a new clipboard and another surprise visit. It was Sunday morning. I was sipping coffee in my socked feet when the sound of Velcro sandals and a smug little hum told me she was back. Deborah stood on my porch with what I now refer to as the compliance crew. 3 residents she'd deputized into becoming foot soldiers in her HOA war. They came armed with clipboards, measuring wheels, and one of those little orange decibel meters you use to test concert halls or airport runways. Apparently, my porch wind chimes had exceeded ambient tranquility thresholds. Also, my car tires had left impressions in the gravel, which she said might suggest vehicular disorder. You think I'm kidding. I thought I was being pranked. But nope, just another episode of Keeping Up with the Wexleys. Then came the seed shells. Deborah knelt in the dirt with the solemnity of a crime scene tech and pointed at a dozen scattered husks under my grandfather's bird feeder. Organic debris violation, she declared, like she'd just caught me dumping oil in the lake. Seed shells promote rodent activity. I reminded her the bird feeder had been there for 20 years. She smiled and said, "So was asbestos." That one stuck with me, not just because it was ridiculous, but because it revealed what this was really about. Deborah didn't care about seeds, fences, or wind chimes. She cared about control. She wanted to scrub my family's history off the land like mildew, and every citation was a tiny eraser stroke. That's when I started to feel it. Not anger, not yet, just that slow, rising burn. Maureen Diaz saw it all from her porch. She didn't say much, just raised her mug and gave me a look that said, "Told you so." Later, she walked over with that nurse's calm she carried like armor. "Deborah's taken down better men for less," she said, handing me a fresh coffee. "The Jenkins boy? Fined into foreclosure. The Delgados? Moved out after she said their garden flags were too celebratory." That's the word she used. Celebratory. As if color and joy were a threat to neighborhood order. Maureen told me Deborah's real power didn't come from the rules. It came from making people think fighting her wasn't worth the stress. She was playing psychological chess while the rest of us were just trying to mow the lawn. And that's when I realized I'd been reacting, not resisting. I spent the next night sitting at my grandfather's old desk, flipping through the packet Deborah had given me on day 1. Community standards, bylaws, supplemental revisions. I read every line, every footnote, every boring clause. That's when I found something. A detail so small it was practically camouflaged, like a snake in dry grass, and it changed everything. My cabin, built in 1971, sat outside the original platting for Clearwater Ridge. The HOA, founded in 2019, had no legal retroactive authority over my land unless I signed something. My grandfather never had, and I sure as hell didn't either. That's when the burn turned into something else. A plan. Because if Deborah wanted to play games with rules, she was about to find out what happens when someone reads the fine print. I looked out at the porch, the bird feeder swaying in the breeze, the fence that used to hold my childhood initials, and I thought, enough of this. I was done measuring bird poop. Time to measure the law. And trust me, what came next? That's when the match hit the fuse. The first sign something was wrong came when I opened the fridge and the light didn't come on. I figured the power was out. No big deal, it's a cabin, things happen. But when I walked outside and saw the entire electrical meter had been yanked clean off the wall like someone stole the battery out of a giant toy, I knew this wasn't an accident. I called the power company, and the guy on the phone told me they'd received a safety work order saying the cabin was vacant and dangerous. Vacant? I'd literally signed for a package that morning. But here's the kicker. He said the work order came through the HOA's maintenance liaison. I didn't even know that was a thing. Apparently, in Clearwater Ridge, sabotage wears a name tag and carries a clipboard. The next day, the water cut out. I went outside and found the shutoff valve had been twisted with enough force to crack the main deliberately. The following morning, sewer backup. Raw sewage burped into the basement like a horror movie with terrible plumbing. I opened the basement door, took one breath, and nearly passed out. Someone had poured concrete down the line. Not clogged, sabotaged. I was looking at over $15,000 in damages, and that was if I could even find contractors still willing to take my calls. Most of them had ghosted me ever since Debra's smear campaign painted me as a problem homeowner. The ones who didn't outright cancel politely suggested I resolve my neighborhood dispute before hiring professionals. Apparently, my name had become radioactive. I went to the sheriff's office, steaming mad, evidence in hand, photos, emails, a timeline. But when I spoke to Deputy Langley, he gave me a smile that made my teeth itch. "Could be kids," he said, like teenagers are out here pouring concrete with contractor-level precision. I told him this was targeted, coordinated, that the damage was too specific to be random. But his tone didn't budge. Then I remembered what Maureen told me, that Debra's husband had donated generously to the sheriff's re-election campaign. And suddenly the deputy's indifference made sense. It wasn't just the HOA anymore. It was the system around it, papered over with favors and plausible deniability. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just up against a bad neighbor, I was up against a whole machine. I tried explaining all this to Lauren, I really did. Sat her down, showed her the concrete in the basement, the emails, the bills. She looked at me like I'd lost the thread. "This is insane, Caleb," she said, her voice sharp around the edges. "You're living in a war zone over a fence and a trash can. What's the end game here?" I told her it wasn't about the fence. It was about principle. About not letting someone stomp on a legacy my grandfather built with bare hands and grit. But the more I talked, the more I sounded like someone fighting shadows. "I didn't sign up for a courtroom romance," she said, grabbing her keys. "Call me when you're done fighting ghosts." And just like that, she left. No slamming doors, no dramatic speeches, just gone. I sat on the porch that night, watching the lake, not feeling much of anything. My hands were raw from cleaning. My savings were draining faster than the water line I couldn't fix. And my heart? Well, it felt like someone had filed a noise complaint inside it. I was losing everything. My girl, my peace, my grip. All because one woman wanted to measure my bird feeder. I was about to call it quits, sell the cabin, let Debra win. But then my phone buzzed at 11:37 p.m., a number I didn't recognize. Gruff voice on the other end. "Caleb Strickland, name's Walt McKinney, I own the land around Lake Mayfield. Heard what Debra's been doing to you. I think it's time we had a chat." And just like that, the story took a turn. Not just for me, but for every clipboard warrior within a 10-mile radius. What Walt said the next day, that changed. Walt McKinney showed up in a truck that looked like it had survived 3 wars and at least 1 divorce. He stepped out in boots older than some HOA board members and offered a handshake like he was testing my bones for weakness. "Son," he said, voice full of gravel and truth, "I've been watching this HOA circus from my back pasture for years, but what Debra did to you? That crossed a line." We sat on the porch, 2 stubborn men with coffee and calluses, watching the lake shimmer like it didn't know it was the center of a Cold War. Walt leaned back, tipped his hat, and said, "What you don't know is, they don't own that lake. Never have? I do." And just like that, he'd tossed a grenade into the HOA's castle. Walt explained it plain. Back in the 70s, he bought 50 acres surrounding Crystal Lake from a rancher who needed to retire and get away from winter. Over the years, folks from the growing subdivision started using the lake, swimming, boating, fishing. Nobody asked. Walt didn't mind. He figured, if they don't litter, I don't bother. But there was never a legal agreement. No easement, no deeded access. just goodwill, and goodwill, he said, has a shelf life, especially when the HOA started acting like they owned the shoreline and the water itself. "Deborah's been strutting around like a rooster in a henhouse I built," he grumbled. "It's time somebody clipped her wings." Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside, deed documents, appraisals, and a number that made me sit up straighter. $2,800,000. 0 cents for 50 acres of prime lakefront, including the only paved road into the water. Below market, but still massive. "I'm moving to be near my grandkids in Florida," Walt said, "and I'd rather sell to someone who gives a damn than to a developer with a bulldozer and a drone." I told him I didn't have that kind of money. He just nodded, like he expected that, and said, "You've got equity in that Denver house, right? Inheritance from your granddad? You ain't broke. You're just not angry enough yet." I spent the next 72 hours talking to brokers, lawyers, my accountant, and a guy named Doug, who claimed he could make things happen if I was willing to sign fast. Turns out, when you're motivated by fury, finances become flexible. Ellis Carter, my lawyer, looked at the paperwork and whistled low. "You buy this, Caleb," he said. "You don't just own dirt, you own leverage." He pointed to the plat map like a general reviewing battle plans. "The HOA's entire identity is built on lake access. Their website, pictures of this lake. Their sales pitch to new buyers, this lake. You take that away and you don't just weaken Debray's power, you erase it." Then he leaned back and added, "Think of it like buying the only gas station in a town full of empty tanks." That's when it hit me. I wasn't just buying land. I was buying the chessboard. And Debra? She'd been bragging about her queen, not knowing I already owned the checkmate. The deal closed in 2 weeks. I signed the final documents at the county office next to Walt, who wore a bolo tie and the expression of a man handing off a legacy. "Use it wisely," he said. I promised I would, though I'll admit, revenge tasted sweeter than I expected. I didn't send out a notice. Didn't make an announcement, I just waited, because while I was finalizing a legal purchase, Deborah was planning her favorite annual event, the Clearwater Ridge Summer Festival. She'd ordered banners, hired a DJ, booked food trucks, and she'd scheduled it right at the lake's edge, assuming it still belonged to her. That's the problem with assuming you own something just because people never told you otherwise. But me? I had the deed in a fireproof box and a plan to flip the HOA playbook upside down. Deborah was preparing to throw her biggest party of the year. What she didn't know was that it would also be her last. The very stage she was building on the shoreline? She'd forgotten to ask permission, and now the ground beneath her feet didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to me. Stay tuned, because the way I crashed that party, let's just say, it made a splash. There's a special kind of irony in watching someone decorate the battlefield they're about to lose. Deborah Wexley had outdone herself this time. Banners flapping, matching HOA polos distributed like team jerseys, and a DJ blasting family-friendly pop at full volume like this was the Super Bowl of suburbia. Her Clearwater Ridge Summer Festival had turned into a full-blown HOA coronation ceremony. There she was at the center of it all, wearing a sash that literally said, HOA Strong, in gold glitter like she was running for mayor of Stepford. Meanwhile, I stood off to the side, holding a deed, a lawyer, and a plan, so quiet it might as well have been whistling. She was halfway through her welcome speech when I made my move. "Folks," I said, stepping toward the mic with Ellis Carter beside me, "if I could have just a moment of your time?" The crowd turned. Deborah blinked. Her smile didn't break, but her voice lost a beat. "This is a scheduled HOA event, Caleb," she said, keeping it chipper. "Perhaps we can revisit your concerns at the next board meeting." I raised the Bluetooth speaker, already playing Ellis's clear, calm voice over the mic. "As of July 18th, he began, my client Caleb Strickland is now the sole legal owner of Crystal Lake and the 50 acres surrounding it, including the only access road currently used by Clearwater Ridge for all community lakefront activities." The crowd rippled. Silence replaced pop music. Deborah's jaw tightened like she'd bit into a lemon that still had the sticker on it. I'm sorry, what? She hissed, but Alice was already opening the briefcase. Here's the deed, filed and recorded with the county. This event, this land, the dock, the entire shoreline, it's now private property. Use without permission is officially trespassing. You could feel the shift. Residents started whispering like they were all waking up at once. Deborah's hand hovered near the mic like she wanted to yank it from me, but wasn't sure if that would make her look like a tyrant or a toddler. This is ridiculous, she said, voice shaking now. We've had access for years. There's precedent. Ellis nodded patiently. There's also a thing called property law. Precedent without permission is just well-mannered trespassing. That one got a chuckle, from more people than I expected. And then came Maureen Diaz. No clipboard, no fuss, just calm steel in khakis. I've lived here 16 years, she said, stepping forward. Deborah fined me because my grandkids left sidewalk chalk drawings of ducks. She said they were graffiti hazards. Someone laughed. Loudly. Mr. Alvarez from Lot 22 raised his hand. I got hit for improper seasonal decor because my wife put up fall wreaths in August. More murmurs. The dam cracked. The Johnsons chimed in about swing set violations. The Noyans spoke up about their porch plants being deemed non-compliant flora. It became a confessional. One after another, people stood up and shared how Deborah had turned neighborhood life into a tightrope of absurdity. Each story made the last one sound more deranged. And she stood there blinking like a motion sensor that couldn't keep up. Deborah snapped. You're all being manipulated, she shouted, her voice rising into dog whistle territory. This man is trying to destroy everything we've built here. He doesn't want order. He wants anarchy. She reached for the mic, but Ellis calmly stepped between us. Actually, he said, he just wants you to stop acting like you own things you don't. And thanks to this deed, now he does. Someone started clapping. Maureen, I think. Then more hands joined. It wasn't thunderous. It was decisive. The kind of applause that says, we're done here. That was the moment I realized something. Justice doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives on folding chairs with lemonade and a stack of legal documents. The crowd didn't just cheer, they stood up, not just for me, but for themselves. That's when Ellis pulled out the final card. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, we also have a petition signed by over 2/3 of residents to initiate an emergency vote to replace the current HOA president. Murmurs. A few gasps. Maureen's name was on the ballot. And when the hands went up, they rose fast and stayed up. Even Deborah's two closest allies couldn't make eye contact. When Ellis announced the results, unanimous except for Deborah herself, it felt like watching a ship slowly sink and still. She stepped back, trembling. No words, no tantrum, just quiet rage swirling behind her eyes. But don't be fooled. She may have lost the lake, the mic, and the crowd, but she hadn't lost her venom. And I knew exactly what kind of storm brews behind a fallen queen's silence. The real revenge? That was coming next, and it wouldn't be polite. Turns out, when you strip power from someone who built their whole personality around it, the fallout doesn't take long. Within a month of the HOA vote, Deborah resigned, or, more accurately, disappeared. Her husband, Robert, filed for divorce not long after. The documents cited emotional instability, reputational damage, and repeated community conflict. Translation: he was tired of being married to a suburban dictator with a god complex and a clipboard fetish. The house she'd lorded over like it was Buckingham Palace went up for sale, quietly, tucked between listings for modest condos and fixer-uppers. But here's the kicker. It sold for $60,000, 0 cents under asking. No one wanted to live in the castle of a deposed queen. The irony was almost too on the nose. Deborah Wexley, high priestess of property values, had trashed her own. Word spread fast that the lake was under new leadership, mine, but I didn't throw my weight around. I didn't build fences or put up residents-only signs. I did what my grandfather would have done, set simple rules. Respect the land. Clean up after yourself. No drama, no drones, no HOA patrols with tape measures and binoculars. And for the first time in years, the lake came back to life. The Johnsons brought their kids to fish off the dock again. The Delgados set up folding chairs and a little Bluetooth speaker, playing actual music without getting fined. Even old man Whitaker, who hadn't been seen outside since 2018, took a kayak out and waved like he'd just been released from house arrest. Freedom looked good on everybody. Then something wild happened. People who'd left started coming back. The Sotos rebought their house at the edge of the cul-de-sac. The Noyens who'd been renting across town moved back in and planted the same bright garden Deborah once called a visual disruption. There was laughter again, casual cookouts, conversations that didn't include veiled threats or rulebook citations. The community wasn't just healing, it was breathing, and maybe the best part? No one was afraid anymore. Of notes taped to the door, of fines in the mailbox, of concerned neighbor complaints whispered like warnings. We traded fear for fire pits, and man, did it feel like something sacred had been restored. As for Lauren, she came back too. Not all at once. It started with a text, then coffee, then a slow Sunday walk around the lake where she said, "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I couldn't watch you lose yourself." I told her she was right, that I'd been burning too hot too fast, that revenge was never the point. It was just the fuel to keep me moving until justice caught up. She smiled. "Well, it did, and so did you. We're still figuring things out. But when someone sees your worst moments and still wants to sit beside you when the smoke clears, that's not just forgiveness. That's grace. And grace, like lakes, needs protecting." The last time I saw Deborah was from my porch. A white sedan crawled down the road, windows cracked, a few moving boxes stacked in the back seat. She didn't stop, didn't wave, just slowed as she passed the cabin, like she was trying to remember how it all went so wrong. Our eyes met for a second, just long enough to recognize what was left of her. Not rage, not entitlement, just a woman who played tyrant until the kingdom crumbled under her heels. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, just stood there with coffee in hand, listening to kids laugh down by the water and neighbors trading stories like it was normal again. Because it was. Deborah thought she ran the show, but I bought the stage, the spotlight, and turned off her mic. And you know what? I didn't just fight back. I built something better, not just for me, but for every neighbor who ever got a fine for a garden gnome or a kid's swing. We turned paranoia into peace, regulation into respect. That lake, once a weapon in Deborah's war, became a place where people finally felt free to breathe again. Not because we banned rules, but because we remembered what rules were supposed to protect in the first place. Community, not control. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a moment you stood your ground, defended what mattered, or finally saw the bully back down, then you get it. You get why it was never just about a trash can. It was about legacy, dignity, and knowing when to turn quiet rage into quiet power. The real lesson here, power isn't about holding a clipboard. It's about holding the line. You don't have to raise your voice to win. You just have to know what's worth fighting for. And sometimes, the sweetest justice is simply restoring what never should have been broken in the first place. If you found value in this story, do me a favor, drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from, like if you've ever tangled with an HOA or dealt with a petty tyrant of your own. And if you're someone who believes in truth, timing, and a little poetic revenge, then subscribe to this channel, because next time, we've got another story that'll have your jaw on the floor and your heart cheering. This is QA Stories, where the good guys don't just win, they own the lake.